Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's dialogue, Insights from the World Development Report 2025 Standards for Development. My name's Rachel Potter, and I'm Associate Communications Manager at ISEAL, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. ISEAL is a global membership organisation working with sustainability systems, businesses and policymakers to strengthen the effectiveness and credibility of voluntary sustainability standards. This session is the first in a new ISEAL dialogue series exploring the key issues shaping the future of sustainability standards. And today's dialogue is focusing on what the findings from the World Development Report 2025 mean for the role of sustainability systems in supporting sustainable development. Before we begin, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping notes. This dialogue is going to be recorded, and the recording will be shared with all registrants in the coming days. We will also upload it to the ISEAL YouTube channel and the ISEAL website, and we will be circulating it through our newsletter. We're very keen for this dialogue to be an interactive session. If you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. We're really hoping to bring as many questions to the panel as possible during the conversation. If you experience any technical difficulties during the session, please use the chat, and my colleague Chloe will try to help you. Through the session, through the dialogue, we'll also be posting links to useful resources in the chat throughout the discussion, so please keep an eye out for those. I'll give you a brief outline now of how the session will run. We will begin with some opening reflections and scene setting. This will be followed by a conversation between Vidya Rangan from ISEAL and Xavier Giné, Director of the World Development Report 2025 Standards for Development, exploring the motivations, findings and recommendations of the report. We will then move into a broader panel discussion before opening the floor to questions from the audience. I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Vidya Rangan is Policy and Engagement Director at ISEAL, where she leads work on policy engagement and strategic dialogue on sustainability systems. We will also be joined by Xavier Giné, Director of the World Development Report 2025 at the World Bank. Sugumar Raman joins us. He is the Chief Program Officer at Fairtrade USA. Sugumar is also a member of ISEAL's Board of Directors. And Lauren Shields is Sustainability Initiatives Lead at the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm very pleased to hand over to Vidya to begin the discussion and set the scene for today's dialogue.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And again, a very warm welcome to all of our listeners into this first ISEAL dialogue, which is a new effort from ISEAL's side to bring to the table discussions that we think are going to be foundational to shape the role of sustainability standards. As Rachel said, today's discussion is going to focus on a very important report that the World Bank published at the end of last year. The World Bank has a flagship report called the World Development Report. And for those of us in development, we've probably grown up reading these reports that have covered some of the most important issues affecting the world, from health to education to the role of the internet and so on. And for those of us working in standards, it came as an absolute pleasant surprise when we did hear that the bank was going to be focusing on the question of standards. And of course, a lot of curiosity on what the World Bank would have to say about the role of standards in development. And so it gives me absolute pleasure to be welcoming Xavier Giné. Xavier has been the lead of the team that has authored the World Development Report. And Xavier, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And we're going to start off with a short chat with you on really both the insight, the learnings, but also the motivations behind why the bank chose this. So let's start off. Why did the World Bank choose to focus its flagship World Development Report on the topic of standards?
Thanks, Vidya. It's a pleasure to be here. So you're absolutely right. I mean, typically World Bank reports cover a well-researched topic. Where there's a lot of literature and a lot of research, and basically puts a spin and thinks about this topic for developing for what the implications of that for policymakers. So, but basically, we wanted to take a different approach here. So this, the starting point, I guess, is that, standards, despite shaping all aspects of our lives, are rarely part of development debates, right? So we basically wanted to, again, these are, I think, under research, underappreciated, and so we wanted to put them center stage. And so the report, I guess, is sort of unique because it's the first to look at standards comprehensively, from education to health, to environment, governance, and basically to show how they can guide public policy, right? So we in so doing, we also wanted to spur a debate among academics and policymakers about the role that standards can play in development.
Thanks so much, Xavier. So building on that, tell us a little bit about what some of the key findings are for you. Now, we all know it's a massive report. It's got close to, if my memory serves me, close to 10 chapters, and it spans standards, quality standards, environmental standards, infrastructure standards, and so on. So what are some of the most important findings for you and for the team from the work you all did?
So basically, I want to highlight two findings, right? So first, when standards are set correctly, they can support growth while managing risks, right? So including environmental risks, financial risks, and so on. But basically, when they're setting correctly, they can lead to stagnation, partial enforcement, or even exclusion, right? Especially for smaller firms. So basically, the second key finding is that standards only deliver benefits when their ambition is matched with a capacity to comply with them, right? So to address this issue, we sort of propose a tiered approach, right? So at the top, you would have the international standard, and then countries can adapt international standard by starting, in a lower rung, again, according to the capacity that they have to comply with it. And so for example, take food safety, right? So the country might start with good hygiene practices, GHPs, and then move on to HACCP, and eventually ISO 22000, right? And so GHP, HACCP are all components to these international standards, right? So you start low, and as you build capacity, you build up to the international standard. Right. So again, as capacity increases, countries should align more and more closely with international standard.
Great. And this point that you're making about the link between the setting of standards and what we're calling implementation capacity, or what your report says uses the term quality infrastructure quite strongly as well. This link is really important. Maybe for those who are not so familiar with the report, tell us, or maybe share examples of why you need to think of it in this way if standards really have to play that role to support development outcomes. Why is that link so important?
Well, because again, inclusion depends on the cost of compliance, right? And so if standards are too complex, or too, only a few firms will be able to comply with them, and so that will probably barely move the needle. So let's move more to sustainability standards, right? And so again, many sustainability standards, of course, aim to raise environmental or social performance, which is very important, right? So of course, no issues there. But again, compliance costs can be too high, and requirements can be too complex, and so small producers can be left out, right? So let me give you a couple of examples of this. So for SMEs in East Africa and coffee and cocoa sectors, right? Just the auditing cost for some of these voluntary sustainability standards can range from $2,000 to $15,000, and that's just the cost of auditing, right? Then you need to think about the cost of upgrading practices of the producers use to meet these standards, right? And so that can also raise that can account for an additional $12,000, right? Now, another important point, especially in the realm of sustainability standards, is that there is fragmentation, right? So that means that there's different standards. Now, there's some interesting research from ITC that suggests that these voluntary sustainability standards, of course, they consider many different criteria, right, for producers to meet the standard. But actually, if you look across these different standards, right, fewer than half of these criteria overlap between any two standards covering the same commodity, right? And so basically what that means is that SMEs or small producers are faced with a dilemma, right? Either support multiple certifications, which adds to the cost, or basically focus on one standard and therefore limit the set of markets that they can reach. Right. And so I guess what comes from the report is that this greater alignment and mutual recognition across standards could make sustainability standards more scalable and accessible.
Thank you. Let's move now into just trying to capture some of the recommendations from the report. So, ISEAL well, a lot of who we expect are listening to today's dialogues are people who work in standards or use standards. And the report, does present some challenging thoughts. You've just raised the question of cost. You've raised the question of multiple standards as well. But the fact that standards play a role in development is a good message to take to this community. So what are some of the recommendations that you'd like to highlight, especially keeping today's audience in mind?
So I would highlight sort of three recommendations, right? One, again, trying to match ambition with capacity. So standards will raise performance, but they need to remain feasible for firms and countries to implement. The second one is, the investment on, you mentioned QI, right? So in order to comply with standards, in order to implement standards, we need infrastructure, right? So whether it's, certification bodies, whether it's labs, et cetera, right? And so these need to go hand in hand with how you set standards. Otherwise, standards are going to be just symbolic, right? Just going to be paper, right? And finally, what's also important is actually the participation of developing countries in when they develop standards, right? And so, when their voices are heard, then they're more likely to reflect their realities, and they're more likely to be widely adopted.
Thanks for sharing those. We know that one of the aims that the bank has always had with WDRs is not just put a report out there and let people read it, but also to work with the development community at large to understand the findings. And your team's been doing this for the last few months. This is probably at least third, if not more, engagement we're having with ISEAL. As you take the report to different countries, to different sectors, to different types of actors who engage with standards, what are some of the reactions you've got? What are the sort of feedback you're getting?
So this is a great question, Vidya. And so let me tell you, I mean, basically we've been talking mostly to the standards community, right? And so this is sort of you guys, and the reaction has been great. I mean, people love it. But basically, it is a lot harder to get policymakers and what I would call I don't know. The population at large call them, people that haven't drank the Kool-Aid, I guess, of standards, right? But it's a lot harder to engage these people, right? So, and I think the problem is here awareness of standards, right? Even within the bank, even within the institution I work for, the frontline staff are not aware of the role that standards can play in development, right? And so they don't put investments in QI or standardization on the radar of government officials. And so I think this has to change, right? The standards community want to use the report. So when you talk to ISO or NSB, so the national standard setting bodies in each country, they want to use the report as evidence to show that standardization is important, and so so that the finance minister can finance some of these investments. But basically, so it's I guess we have to work on a two-pronged approach, right? So one is the standards community in their dialogues with governments, they can use the report, but also we need to do sensitization, within the bank and in other development and donor partners to basically put that on the agenda, right? And so now this dialogue, though, with governments will require data on the cost and benefits of using standardization, right? So think about, again, the Ministry of Finance that is deciding whether to use the limited resources they have to, say, build more roads or invest in the quality infrastructure that's going to make ensure that the roads are meet certain quality, right? And so how they decide to build more roads or put money into QI that to ensure the quality of the roads that are being built is a decision that requires data, and sometimes this data is lacking, actually.
Super interesting. And we're going to come back to this question of engaging with policymakers and implication for policy in the panel. But maybe one last question to you before we bring our other panelists in. What do you see as the biggest implication of this report for how standards should evolve over the next decade?
Yeah, so what I would basically say here, Vidya, is that I think, if anything, that the report shows is that there is a need for flexibility and these tiered approaches to standards, right? So, the voluntary sustainability standards that you guys develop and you guys are engaged in, frankly, they're great for the top performing firms, which are typically exporters, right? I mean, these are standards that are typically demanded by the buyers in more developed countries. But basically, at the country level, these sort of standards, again, they're sometimes too complex, and so we need to think about whether they move the needle or they basically raise the average quality and average sustainability in the country, right? And so we believe that this tiered approach would allow more firms to find certification profitable, and so that would as there's more demand, there's maybe private sector can come in, and so maybe then there's a reduction in compliance costs. And that basically would bring adoption at scale and with larger impact. So that's I think the goal, right? I mean, to use these tiered approaches to not only engage with the top performing, but actually a larger swath of the production capacity of countries.
Thanks so much, Xavier, for these early remarks. I'm now going to invite our two other panelists to join in. So stay with us. We're going to bring you into the panel discussion as well. But Sugumar and Lauren, welcome to the conversation. You've been listening to Xavier's thoughts, and I know the two of you have dipped into the report as well. I don't know if you've read all of it, but I know that you have also found it very interesting. So let's dive straight into some of your thoughts. Sugumar, let me start with you. You've been working in the field of standards for more than 25 years. You've worked with multiple systems. You also sort of have a strong overview of the strengths, weaknesses, limitations, challenges, levers that standards can use. What stood out for you from the WDR as you went through it?
Thanks, Vidya. And Javier, it was an absolute pleasure listening to how you were explaining the journey of building that report. One thing that really did stand out in this report was this one line, how standards can enable participation or allow access, but if it is not implemented well, it can also be a barrier. So it's sort of like a double-edged sword. And that's in some form symptomatic of a lot of things that is currently happening, especially within the sustainability standards space, where compliance to requirements is either used as a way to access or gain access to markets versus it also being used in some form to prevent access to markets because of lack of proper implementation. So if I would say there was one thing that stood out, then that was that one line. And of course, the next big thing that the other side observations that I had was around how these voluntary and private standards, they're standing alongside regulations that are sort of like coming increasingly into our space. So the need for for these standards to coexist with regulations and complement them. That I think is another key element that I also noticed in the report.
Thanks so much, Sugumar. Lauren, let me bring you in. Obviously, as OECD and specifically your team that looks at responsible business conduct, straddles both worlds. I mean, you work directly with business and governments to shape business behavior in the marketplace, but you also work very closely with standards. And I know you're interested in a lot of the questions that the report talks about. What were some of your key takeaways?
Yeah, thanks very much, Vidya, and pleasure to be on the panel with Sugumar and Xavier. But yeah, it's funny, some of the kind of the things that will stick with me, I think, I mean, just to say for a quite kind of technical area, I do appreciate the World Bank's effort here to bring some visuals. So I've been looking at stoplights a bit differently the last few days, so one of the images that sticks with me is the spaghetti bowl kind of issue that came through in the report, and I think to some extent in Xavier's comments as well. So really thinking about overlapping standards, and when you kind of put those in a regulatory context, the risks become even more. So one thing that we think about at the OECD in our work on responsible business conduct is really thinking about how can we support coherent approaches, both in a regulatory landscape and various regulatory tools with policymakers, but also embedding those key kind of concepts that are relevant to our work, particularly around due diligence. So key concepts from our standards into voluntary sustainability standards as well, and really kind of focusing on those key concepts. One to kind of call out is the risk-based approach. So really starting where risks are higher, putting more resource there as opposed to trying to address all things, which I think when you hear Xavier's reflection on hundreds of different criteria across that are an individual smallholder may need to respond to, you really see that that's kind of not manageable. So really, that really resonates with us in terms of overlapping standards and a need for greater coherence. And then I think the other thing that we are grappling with quite a bit at the OECD and with our policymaker community is taking seriously the question of who bears the cost. And Xavier spoke very kind of eloquently about that here. And really thinking about, what are the incentives and what is the support that's really needed as producers are aiming to be to kind of take this tiered approach that Xavier was speaking about to better performance. So those were the two that that are really sticking with me about kind of spaghetti bowl and the cost for producers and how to address those.
Thanks, Lauren. So let me come back to you. One of the key insights from the bank is that we need to shift our focus from just compliance as a standards community to the role of standards in driving real-world social and environmental outcomes. And I think it's fair to say that standards, at least the most credible ones, have always had impacts at their heart. But what does this shift look like? This is a question of the evolution of standards to not just be looking at assurance and compliance, but also transforming those into levers of change. What are your reflections on that shift?
Vidya, one observation that I've been having in around standards and certification in particular, and again taking a leaf out of what Javier was mentioning, cost and access to markets, especially when it is standards based, is very much dependent on the maturity of an organization. So when you have a compliance based standard, it basically has this filter where organizations that are not mature enough to comply are therefore excluded from accessing those kind of markets. So I think while compliance is important, we cannot move away from that. We need to also look at this compliance plus approach. What more can we do? Rather than tracking practices, tracking outcomes or progress over time. So that basically means that let's take a produce organization. A produce organization can enter with the lowest entry barrier, and the progress that they're making could probably be better tracked to see what is actually happening as impact on the ground, rather than a specific milestone that they need to kind of reach. So I feel that would be an evolution that we would all need to embrace. And that's the only way that we can make the market that much more accessible. That's the first element. The second, if we focus solely on compliance, the contexts are very different for different countries, and that also builds a little bit of an exclusion. And the third is, just by tracking practices does not mean that the outcome that we're trying to drive, most of our impact-based standards, it's not a given that the outcome would sort of be reached. For example, if you want the knowledge level or the capacity of a producer organization on best agriculture practices, I'm giving this as an example, is measured. At the moment, it is measured through the number of trainings that we create. Just the sheer number of trainings does not automatically imply that knowledge would have been imparted. So if we can find a way of measuring the knowledge through other means than just tracking how many training sessions have been provided, then that is a much better way of managing this. And now with disclosure standards like TNFD or GRI out there, who have a much more mature and coherent way of measuring outcomes, it's just a matter of time before all standard systems could potentially delve into these kind of resources and start looking at how they can build outcome indicators, etc. And so, for in an agriculture standard, being able to look at the soil health rather than looking at the measures you're putting for soil erosion, for example, or measuring water consumption, and tracking that over a period of time, or measuring income, and seeing how much of income gaps are getting reduced between genders. All of that can easily be tracked much better through outcome indicators. We will still need some kind of checks and balances. I'd like to use the word no harm criteria. You do not want to create any harm for the people or the planet. So there would be this need for us to go into yes, no kind of situations, or compliance-based situations. But in all other areas, I think outcome-based approaches would be much more effective.
Thanks, Sugu. And let's very quickly maybe touch on this question of scale as well. And Javier mentioned this in his closing remarks, where he said the opportunity really is that if you take a tiered approach, you've written a coherent standard, you're supporting capacity building, putting the implementation capacity and quality infrastructure in place, it can really scale up quite quickly and have impacts both in economic terms and, in our case, sustainability terms quite quickly. For our listeners, tell us a little bit about what you think standards need to do to achieve that scale, especially thinking about the inclusivity, the accessibility questions that Javier also brought up, and maybe some examples from what you're seeing in schemes you work with.
Yeah, so, and I want to, again, Javier, sorry, I have to pull words out of some of the messages that you are conveying, because it makes absolute sense. With standards, if you really look at it, the standards landscape in the last 25, 30 odd years, and you see this proliferation of standards, right? And standards, and if you look at a producer organization, the number of requirements that they would need to meet for each of these standards is mind-boggling. And in a lot of cases, these are, lack of a better word, you need to have been compliant. You need to have had these certifications for you to be able to access these kind of markets. And if you look at these standards and you sort of like place them, the differences between these multiple standards are very nuanced. They're not that distinct from each other. And I think as standard systems, I think we should take a concrete or a concerted effort to find ways of mutual recognition, making standards and programs interoperable to, in some form, reduce the cost of compliance, the cost of trying to meet the standards. Also, being able to recognize standards would mean that you're reducing the audit fatigue, which is I was speaking to a producer organization, and they were talking about 30 audit days a year with multiple audits coming in. So the audit fatigue and the cost associated with that is something that we can really go in and address. And I think that's one of the big areas that we need to work on. The second is being able to make sure that the entry barrier is not too high. So being able to allow the most immature of producer organizations, stakeholders to be able to participate in the standard is quite an important. And we can of course build the development pathways, over time. So that's a big area that we should be actually working. The third is the standards. When we're creating the standards, we should also make sure that the standards are inclusive. So meaning that it should capture the perspective of the target audience that the standard is directed towards. So how the standards are getting built, how the governance structure behind decisions on what elements will be captured into that standard should be built in by these target groups. Only then would the standard work for them. Otherwise, it's just a kind of a paper tiger. And last but not least is while all of these frameworks do exist, we need to put a structured process in capacity building. So not all audiences, not all targets groups are of the same maturity, and being able to support them with different forms to build their capacities to be able to meet these requirements, but also to get the best out of these standards would be key with it.
And I think that's really interesting. You're working with standards, but you can't take a simple standardized approach to just making sure that everybody is able to make the most from it. Thanks for sharing that. I want to now move into some of the policy implications of this. So Lauren, I'm going to come to you, and Xavier, I'm going to bring you back into the discussion as well. Lauren, you mentioned the smart mix in your first remarks in terms of we're living in this world right now where it's particularly interesting right now in Europe, right? Because you had an ambitious Green Deal, lots of movement was made. There's a bit of backpedaling now. We kind of don't know whether some of the most important of these laws are going to see the light of day. So we're living the questions around the smart mix. And I know the OECD is very engaged in this question of what does policy coherence look like? Because you work both with the business community and with the policy community, and you're in a unique position to actually understand both perspectives. So for you, what does a smart mix between voluntary approaches and mandatory approaches look like in the field of sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, let me start with some of our kind of grounding documents a bit. So the OECD's recommendation on the role of government in promoting RBC recommends that countries develop and enforce a legal and regulatory framework to enable responsible business conduct aligned with our standards. But beyond that, countries have freedom of methods. And so this is really where the smart mix comes in. It can look a lot of different ways. And what we're seeing in practice is many governments are already combining mandatory and voluntary approaches. And so the role of sustainability systems play in that mix varies considerably depending on how governments choose to kind of address that, and that's completely appropriate. Maybe just to kind of call out a few examples here, we really do see a spectrum of what this smart mix can look like. At one end, some governments take on a more active oversight role of sustainability systems. So by formally recognizing specific initiatives that align with their policy objectives. So an example of that is the conflict minerals regulation and upcoming batteries regulation in the EU. Where there's kind of recognition of specific initiatives. At the other end, there are some frameworks that are a much more kind of flexible approach, and often then policymakers task companies themselves with understanding the relevance and the credibility of the initiatives that they use. So the CSDDD, deforest regulation are working a bit more in that way. And in some cases, governments are actually going, a bit of a step further and developing their own sustainability systems. So the German Green Button certification is an example of that. So, the point here is that there's no single template. The smart mix will look different across different jurisdictions, sectors, risk profile, and that makes sense. What matters from our perspective is the conditions under which the mix works well. So this is where this kind of big question about system credibility, and from, again, with my due diligence goggles on, we look at, is a sustainability system credibly supporting one or more steps of the due diligence process, and is it clear on what it does cover and what it doesn't cover? And we're doing a bunch of work on kind of supporting and responding to that need through fitness criteria, which I can speak about another time. But yeah, that's kind of our thoughts on smart mix.
Thanks, Lauren. Javier, let me come back to you, and I want to pick up on two aspects. So I know that the bank and the report do not use the smart mix terminology directly. You do have insights about where voluntary and mandatory can work together, and where should policymakers shift from when a voluntary approach is not good enough for standard setting and actually make that law. So do you want to just explain to our listeners the insight from the report? Because I think that's a really important point about the trade-offs between voluntary and mandatory standard setting.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, what I'll say is that, following on what Lauren said, so governments should use a combination of both voluntary and mandatory standards. So basically, voluntary standards, our take is that they should be left to the industry as much as possible. That's where the expertise lies, the role of the government should only be to convene the private sector when there's no standard and one is needed, or when there's too many standards and there are needs for harmonization, right? Also, I want to say that the government or the standards body also needs to play the role of convening even across regulatory agencies within the government, right? And so actually, there's a very interesting example from the US where basically, I think it was EPA that basically banned a chemical that was very toxic, okay? Now, that chemical, it turns out that it's the only one that, so in order to clean certain medical devices, they need that. That's the only substance that can clean you see that there's contradictory standards or rules within the government, and so somebody needs to play this convening role of allowing, basically, when standards are set, a period of comments, to reach consensus, right? And so that's actually missing in a lot of the countries, and it is important, right? And so again, raising awareness of why standards can be used, how standards can be better used for regulations. And so now, of course, there are also mandatory standards that are set. Of course, these are very different. These are to set. Of course, the environment. We care about the environment. We care about food safety, for example. We care about health, and so these are the areas under the remit of regulations mostly. But even then, I think this smart approach is interesting, right? So what our take is that regulations should set the broad requirements and then leave the industry to set standards and to tell us how they're going to comply with the requirements setting the regulations, right? And so this is the whole referencing of standards that should be set not necessarily by the regulators, but by the private sector, where again, so that's where where we see this combination of
And that's a very interesting, I think, point that I want to underline, because in all the talk about the smart mix that we're hearing right now, it's a difficult choice to make as to when something takes the shape of law and when something should be left to the realm of voluntary standards. In fact, with a lot of regulation coming in from Brussels under the rubric of the sort of Green Deal, a lot of the questions were raised around whether VSS are no longer needed. Are voluntary tools redundant? But what we're seeing is actually no. Businesses and governments are using them very smartly in terms of, where they're still using voluntary sustainability standards, either because they want to meet a higher bar or they want to innovate. But where governments want to create a level playing field, where they want to set what minimum requirements for good look like, they want to write that into law. So I'd encourage everyone to at least read that section of the report, because I think it's really useful.
Vidya, if I may, and this is actually something that I learned from you very early on, when we were doing consultations for the report, which is, voluntary. We sometimes view voluntary standards as sort of, raising the ceiling, right? I mean, it's more catered towards, the top performers or the firms that want to signal that they have extra quality. Now, typically mandatory standards are concerned with a different part of the distribution, right? I mean, it's about raising the floor, if you will, right? And setting the floor and sort of raising the floor, right? And so both, can come, both, affect different firms, right? And of course, some, everybody needs to comply with the floor, but not everybody needs to comply with these voluntary standards, right? And so how we do that is part of the
opportunity. Yeah.
Exactly.
Can I come in on that, Vidya?
Absolutely. Come in.
No, I was just thinking about, I mean, I think that's a really interesting kind of floor versus ceiling, and the kind of ongoing relevance of sustainability systems as regulatory frameworks are evolving right now. I mean, I guess one other thing that we discuss quite a bit with our policymakers is when we look at sustainability systems, they often have something that governments and most companies do not. They have long-term embedded presence where risks are most severe. And from a due diligence perspective, this is critical, obviously. And so, a fair trade that is supporting millions of farmers and working across many partner countries is really critical kind of in that role. So just to kind of give another possible framing of the role that sustainability systems can play in this space, like the OECD really frames sustainability initiatives as potential multipliers of good responsible business conduct practice. So really extending reach upstream, pooling resources across different buyers, providing localized tools and data, and kind of really driving, in this case, kind of due diligence systems on the ground. So I think that's another way to kind of think about the contribution of sustainability systems, even as the smart mix is in flux.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. Super interesting. I want to now change gears a little bit to move into this question of credibility, or what do good standards look like? The World Development Report mentions this. You mentioned this as well, Lauren. But before we do that, just a shout out to all of our listeners. Please start putting your questions in. I'm going to try and weave these into the discussion in the time we have left. So, let me come to you, Xavier. There is a section of the bank's report that's talking about what people need to look for when they look for good standards. And you do mention the word credibility specifically there. Tell us a little bit about why that was a really important message to take, and what are some of the key things that you think people need to be looking out for in terms of what makes for good standards?
Sorry, Vidya. I mean, I'll go back to again, these need for balance between the ambition of standards and the ability to comply with them, right? So yeah, again, if this is out of whack, right? If you set standards that are too ambitious, you're not going to be able to. Yeah, these are going to be. I think Sugu mentioned. These are paper tigers, right? I mean, these are standards that are not enforced, and that leads to partial enforcement. That leads to exclusion, right? And so we don't want that. And so it's really finding these balance between ambition and the ability to comply. So yeah, I'll
Thanks, Xavier. Sugu, let me bring you in. You've sort of lived the world of credible standards. You've worked for different schemes. You're part of the ISEAL community. We certainly desire and work towards setting definitions, but also helping schemes be more credible. Why do you think that is such an important parameter to keep in mind in both the context of understanding this report, but also really the role of standards in the world right now?
Thanks, Vidya. I think one of the most important things is when we are looking at a sustainability system like ours, we're trying to go for a positive impact, or we're trying to drive towards a positive impact. And the standards, if I may, is the vehicle. So if the standard is not able to do what it is promising to do, then the idea behind having the standard is lost, right? And that's why the concept of making sure that we have a credible standard is the key. And some of the elements, and I think the most, or for me at least, the biggest element of having a credible standard is that it should be an inclusive standard. It should take the voice of all the stakeholders, especially the target audience. And you can see these words coming from me because I'm from fair trade, so the producer voice is super important, or the worker voice, and so that is one of the critical element for the credibility of the standard. Apart from that, all the practices, and to sort of like make this in very simple English, credibility is about doing what we're saying we are doing in general, so oversimplified way. So we're making sure that we're promising what is realistic and delivering on that promise. That in some form plays a big role in harboring the credibility of the standard. And that I think is one of the key elements as well.
Thank you. Lauren, let's come to you. We know that the question of credibility, or what some policy frameworks are calling fitness for purpose or fitness criteria of standards, is really taking center stage as a lot of policies are being written. I mean, and you look at a wide range of EU policies, whether you take the deforestation regulation, whether you take the claims regulation, you take the CSDDD, they're all kind of saying the same thing. They're saying, if you as business want to work with standards, yes, do it. But this is what we think good standards should look like. And they're calling that fitness criteria. Help our listeners understand why a credible standard is important for business to understand how they can support them. Because people think of credibility as this very academic, sort of nebulous concept. Why is it so important for businesses to understand what credible standards are?
Great question. And I think actually I'm going back a little bit to Xavier's comment about even the kind of frontline workers at the World Bank not understanding this kind of universe of standards, and this not being necessarily well understood. So, I mean, one thing we see in our work around sustainability systems is that in many cases, certainly policymakers and business as well may not have a great understanding of what is the difference between various initiatives, how is an initiative contributing to my different strategic objectives as a business. And so for us, the idea of fitness criteria, credibility criteria is trying to support some critical reflection on the side of companies as well as on the initiative side on kind of what does good look like when we're talking about an initiative's support in due diligence. So I think what we heard from Sugumar is absolutely right. Like at the core, it's doing what we say we are doing. And so what we see within this kind of fitness criteria, there are like several different dimensions to think about. What we've put out in some draft fitness criteria that we're currently consulting is thinking through from a governance and stakeholder perspective, what does good look like? From an implementation and assurance perspective, outcomes and impact, and then on kind of market mechanisms and efficiency. So I think resonating quite a bit with the comments of my other panelists about importance of accessibility and inclusion of smallholders and local context, but also thinking about cost sharing and really making sure that these are systems that are driving efficiency in reaching the policy objectives that the government set.
Thank you. I'm going to weave in some questions that have been coming in from our listeners. And Xavier, I'm going to bring this to you because they're both sort of asking the same thing, but I think it's a super interesting way to spend the last 8 minutes we have. So the questions are really saying that you're saying that there's a role for different types of standards, and you're saying that we can take a tiered approach because each of them has a reason to exist. They have differences. But what do you do when the market you want to get into is always asking for the highest standard, right? So there's an internal contradiction with trying to calibrate the market's expectation of what good looks like and your belief that actually it is useful to take a continuous improvement or tiered approach. So how do we work with this contradiction?
Oh, no, great question. So there's got to be. So when we talk about the tiered approach, of course, for any firm, any producer to adopt standards, there's got to be incentives, right? And so, alongside proposing this tiered approach, we need to think about, what these incentives might be, right? And so, yes, I mean, you may not be, if with only, going back to the food safety again, right? So if you meet GHP, right, good hygienic practices, you may not be able to sell, of course, to export to a high income country, right? But you may be able to find a supermarket that is now willing to, with your certification, is willing to accept your produce, right? And so, or you may find a lender that is willing to give you, funds to actually move up to the next certification, right? Or you may work with a local government that now, wants to procure food. Say, a school feeding program, right? I mean, and suppose that, these are all over Africa, right? And so suppose now that the schools require these basic certification, right? I mean, they're not going to require international standard, but so again, that's why you start low, and then you meet this standard, and then you slowly build up, right? And so once you can produce for the school, and you've upgraded your systems with GHP, then you may want to move to HACCP and eventually move up, right? And so and the beauty of this is that the more firms are demanding certifications, be it at whichever rung it is, then the cost, the private sector might come in, and the cost of certifications may actually come down, right? And so because to train a consultant for ISO 22000 or GHP or HACCP, is marginal, right? But the more consultants you have, the cheaper it is. You don't have to fly the guy from Germany or whatever. They might be already in country, right? And so these can be at scale, right? When you have certification at scale, for these different levels, you can again lower the cost of compliance and then increase certification, right? And so it's putting everybody into these culture of quality, and of course there's many. Sorry, I hope is this clear what I'm.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Don't worry. That was a good example. No.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that response. There's another question that's come in, but this is probably one where I'll want the other panelists to weigh in as well. So when we were talking about the smart mix, you were saying that it is sometimes quite important for governments to step back and allow industry to lead standard setting on some areas, on what good could look like. But if you leave standard setting, even if it's only voluntary standards, to industry or private sector, let's say because there's a need to innovate or design something new, how is that going to genuinely result in multi-stakeholder processes? Because it's led by sort of one actor in the market. So I suppose the question is it genuinely possible to develop multi-stakeholder consensus if voluntary standard setting is left to only one actor in the market or is being led by one actor?
This is an example where maybe sustainability standards should not be exclusively left to the industry, because then, we maybe we don't have any standard, right? And so, sorry, I don't want to get in trouble, yeah, these views are only mine, right? I mean, so just I guess I should have led with that. But look, I mean, for other standards, right? I mean, of course, again, the industries where the expertise is, and so, yeah, I mean, these guys, again, the point of developing a standard is adoption and usage of the standard, right? I mean, a standard that's not being adopted or used, I mean, so the standards, again, should be developed. I mean, these are very technical discussions, right? To come up with a standard, and so of course it should be left to whoever's going to be using the standard, which is typically the industry. Now, we can talk about the 6 principles of an international standard, right, or international setting body, and of course inclusion is there, right? But there, what I would say is, again, the industry needs to play a role. Of course, the government and academics and and consumers need to play a role. But it's mostly also, especially for developing countries, is about the cost to adoption of the standard or of compliance with the standard, right? And so that's why it's important that their voices are heard, right? And so you're absolutely right that in some sectors, if you take the tech sector, these are not necessarily very inclusive, right? I mean, because they're developed by a few firms, and but that's for again, for standards that need to be used broadly, it is important that there is the participation of developing countries.
Sugu, I want to bring you in for maybe a last comment on this one as well. There's always going to be people out there who think that if industry is represented, given its power, its leverage in the value chain, they have an undue influence over the setting of the standard or the running of the scheme. How can we respond to that criticism and skepticism that actually, even if it's voluntary, these schemes should really be able to build multi-stakeholder consensus in the way they set their schemes up? And 1 minute, Sugu.
Vidya, I would use the word "go where the tension is." So what you're putting is a typical tension where you have the buyer seller relationship, and the power dynamics is the reality of this world. And I think avoiding the tension is not going to solve that problem, but doubling down and making sure that multi-stakeholder participation and standards being developed with inputs from the producers or the stakeholders with the same kind of weightage as we would expect from businesses, and also civil societies, who typically tend to be more neutral than the businesses per se, is a necessary thing for us to have a standard that is actually delivering on what it is promising. Without that, it is just one side of the coin.
All right. Well, we're absolutely at time. I know we could go on for a few more hours at least, but at this point, I just want to say a huge thanks to all of our 3 speakers, to Xavier for being so open with your time in helping, this world understand what to take away from this, what I think is quite a brilliant report, to Sugumar and to Lauren for being active participants and helping us navigate some of the tough questions around standards. I'm going to hand it back to my colleague Rachel now to close us off.
Thank you so much to everybody that's attended. We've had wonderful participation and very interactive discussion in the chat. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for such an interesting and insightful conversation. We hope that today's dialogue has really provided some useful perspectives on the role of standards in supporting sustainable development and how sustainability systems can continue to evolve in a changing landscape. If you'd like to stay connected with ISEAL and continue the conversation, you can follow us on LinkedIn, visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and listen to our podcast. We've shared all of those links in the chat. For those who are interested, we have ISEAL's public training workshops kicking off this year, with the next one starting in April. Please visit our website for more details. And finally, we're very excited to be hosting our Global Sustainability Symposium in Accra, Ghana this June, where we are bringing together leaders from across policy, business and sustainability systems. We would be delighted to see you there. And again, you'll find details on our website. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you.